Okay, so I've been given this question: does evolution disprove a created Earth? And Carla's already very kindly answered it for us. So there we are, coffee break. Oh, if only it was all that simple. It'd be great, wouldn't it? When I was asked this question, it sort of took me back to probably the last talk, sort of sciencey talk that I did, and it was all the way back in 2009, and it was the 150-year celebration of the publication of Charles Darwin's famous book On the Origin of Species. Has anyone here read On the Origin of Species? Yeah, two of us, there we go. It's worth reading. It is worth reading so you can understand what the other side is saying. Well, I was asked to do a talk on this topic because I was at Bible college, and the minister of my placement church asked me to do a talk. And for the talk, I selected Exodus 20 verse 11, which is a really interesting verse. Because a lot of people, they have all sorts of questions about Genesis 1 and whether it's history or whether it's fiction or something like that. Exodus 20 verse 11 is there. It's in the middle of the Ten Commandments, a part of the scripture which everyone accepts as history. And we read, "For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day." And from that starting point, I laid out that I believed that Darwin was wrong. I believed that the Bible taught a recent creation with death being introduced as a result of the fall of man. And boy, did we have a discussion about it afterwards. There was a really mixed reception about this because it divided the congregation into two groups. And there were some who agreed with everything that I said, and then there were some people who were really quite upset that I'd been allowed to go up the front and share my strange views. And I had some really memorable conversations with people after it as well. And one person I spoke to, he was a city banker, so a very important job. And he told me that he just couldn't believe in a recently created earth because his colleagues at work would think that he was mad. And he wanted to share the gospel with them. So he wanted to not talk about creation at all and just sort of adopt evolution, and then from that point tell people about Jesus. He felt that believing in a recent creation was the same as believing in a flat earth. It was that ridiculous in the eyes of some people. Other Christians feel that this subject is just far too complicated for them. Maybe science wasn't their favourite subject in school, and there's all sorts of long and difficult words being used, and they struggle with it, so they just say, "I don't understand, I'm going to leave it to someone else." Other people think that it's just one great big argument, and that really it's all smoke and no light. It's just confusion, it's different opinions, and it leads to trouble and strife. And that's how some people feel. But where you stand on creation is an important subject for two reasons. First of all, if you want to understand the Bible. To understand the Bible properly, you've got to see how it all fits together. And then when we look at the Bible and the storyline of Scripture, we see that it starts with creation, God making a perfect earth. And then it all goes wrong. And it's our fault that it goes wrong. That's the fall. And then most of the rest of Scripture is all about what God is doing to sort out the problem. It's a redemption. And then we look forward to the end, or what theologically is called the consummation. But really, I think it's even better understood as a restoration. That's a more understandable word for that. And in fact, that ties in with what Cole's going to be talking about later. Because if we want to understand suffering in this world and how God relates to it, we've got to recognise that this world is not what God originally made. It's been changed. So creation and what you stand on it, where you stand on it, is really important. If you're someone who believes in theistic evolution, and think that God has used evolution and natural selection and death and the survival of the fittest as a way of getting us to where we are today, then you're changing what the Bible is teaching about these problem areas, about death and suffering, and in many ways you're changing the character of God as well. So it is important. And then the second reason is we need to understand about creation and what the Bible teaches so that we can answer people's questions about evolution. Because there's people out there with lots and lots of questions about evolution. We live in a society where people are told that evolution has disproved a created earth. So my aim this morning in this section is to look at some areas of evidence that show that evolution doesn't have all of the answers. And hopefully we'll be able to pick up a few bits and pieces and pointers to help us talking with folk. I'm trying to keep things simple because I recognise that there's technical language used which is unfamiliar to people. And every subject has technical language. You know, if you're a plumber, if you're an electrician, there's a technical language that people outside don't understand. And the same is true with science. There's a technical language. So I'm going to try and simplify things. But there is the odd complicated bit, because to do this properly, I've got to quote people. And sometimes the quotes have technical language in. So I'm going to try and explain things as we go along. So this question, does evolution disprove a created earth, is the sort of question that some people are asking. As I look around, I believe that most of us here go to churches and we already know how we'd answer that question. But there may be some folk here who they're just not sure about it. They want more information about it, or they may have family, they may have friends who are asking this sort of question. And they're asking it because of this great drive out there which says evolution's got the answers. And if you don't believe in evolution, there's something wrong with you. Just take this quote from Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins is that well-known atheist. He's a great advocate for evolution, and he once said, if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is either ignorant, stupid, or insane. You can see why the person in London, that banker, thought that believing in creation would put him into the flat earth category. Because that's how people are presented if they believe in a creator God, as ignorant and stupid and insane. Whenever you watch those wonderful TV shows hosted by some of these people, David Attenborough or Chris Packham or Brian Cox, you hear them very calmly and very factually saying that this world is millions or billions of years old and that life has just evolved. And people trust these personalities. Now, they wouldn't be allowed on TV if they were wrong, is what some people think. And for them, the question, does evolution disprove a created earth? It's a closed question. They just say, no, evolution has won the argument, hands down. But is that the right position to adopt? If there was nothing at stake in this debate, then it really wouldn't matter. But when you take time to think about it, you would discover that it is a very important question. And the way that you answer it will change the way that you understand the world that we live in. If evolution has disproved a created earth, then we are here by chance, we have no meaning, there is no future, and it really doesn't matter how we behave because nobody cares. But if the world is created, then there is a creator. And this means that you are designed. And when we look at the Bible, we see that people have got a purpose. We've got value. How we behave really matters. Which means that it is an important question for us to be thinking about. So hopefully, as we start to think more about this, I'm going to give you some food for thought and ways to undermine people's certainty that evolution has all of the answers. But first of all, I ought to explain why I'm up here doing this talk, because Most of you know I'm the minister here at this church. I'm a pastor, and that means I spend a lot of my time preparing sermons and theological talks and visiting people and drinking tea. And of course, I only work 1 day a week, obviously. That's well known, that is. What gives me the right to talk about evolution and science? Well, something that a lot of people don't realise is that church pastors had a life before they were called to the ministry. And some of us had all sorts of different sorts of jobs. And my job, before I was called into the ministry, was being a scientist. And I was an immunobiochemist for a pharmaceutical company. I worked in the development group, and my job was to design the tests that we used to make sure that our products worked and that they were safe for people. And so I was there, I was introducing new technology into that situation. And I was really pleased with this picture behind us, because this is from a video of my old company, and I have stood there and done that work. That is one of the labs I used to work in. I was really pleased to find it. And I had a close look, and some of this equipment is equipment that I've used. And I think it's quite possible, looking at what's there and that paperwork, he was doing a test that I designed. So that is what I used to do. And for those of you who've got a more scientific background, my particular focus was on developing ELISAs, which are enzyme-linked immunosorbent assays, and working with PAGE techniques, which is polyacrylamide gel electrophoresis. Oh. Yeah, obviously everyone understands that. They do. Basically, I mix things together and they change colour. That's what it was. So that's what I did, and that was my career between the end of 1999 and the middle of 2008. And I've got scientific training and a good amount of experience at the laboratory bench. But then the Lord called me away to Bible college, so I put down my pipette and headed up to London, and I spent 3 years at Oak Hill College, where I learnt a little bit about the Bible as well. So I have the rare distinction of having professional training in both science and theology. So this is an area that's been of particular interest to me down through the years. I've had a lifelong interest in the natural world, and I've been wrestling with the question of how evolution and creation fits together since about the age of 12. So I've spent quite a bit of time thinking about this. Well, as a Christian, working as a scientist, as a Bible-believing scientist, I had no trouble at all doing the sort of work I was doing. And I just want to stress something now, which some people get confused about. Some people think that science and Christianity are enemies, that they're out to get each other, that they're incompatible. But that is a load of nonsense. Science and its companion, technology, are incredible gifts that God has given us, which greatly improve our lives. You know, just think back through your life and the changes that have been brought about because of science and technology. It's November, we've had some rainy weather on us, and we've been able to go out in the cold weather wearing these waterproof jackets, which are wonderful. They take the perspiration away from our bodies, they keep us dry, completely unknown, 100 years ago, that sort of thing. And when you think about medicine, think about the plagues that you read about in school, the Black Death, the bubonic plague. That first turned up in the 1300s, it reappeared in the 1500s, there was an enormous outbreak in the 1800s, it killed millions of people, went through and would devastate sometimes 40-50% of the population. And it was only in the 1900s that there was some sort of treatment for it. And then contrast that with COVID. COVID pops up and had all the makings of something more deadly than bubonic plague. It spread quickly, it really knocked people down, and under a year later, the first vaccines are being rolled out. That's the difference that science and technology make. What took hundreds of years to be cured can now be sorted out in just a year. And that was an incredible achievement, getting those vaccines out in that length of time. Without science and technology, our lives would be much harder, they would be shorter, Most of them would really struggle with terrible diseases, which we pick up and then we live through life with. And then, of course, there's always things like infant mortality as well. Science and technology have greatly improved those areas. And while there is the odd ethical concern here and there, most of the time, Christianity and science, they're friends. They get on well. So the area where problems start to develop is where science moves beyond what it can observe directly by experiments and moves into the world of philosophy and trying to extrapolate from the past what's happened today. And that's what evolution does. Evolution is not something that can be observed. It's something where people look at data, information that they've found, and they use it to tell a story. So I want to spend a couple of minutes thinking, what is evolution? Because this is important. When we say evolution, people have got all sorts of ideas. We need to understand what we're arguing against. This is why in the world of apologetics, it's always important that you read something of what the other side is saying. Otherwise, you just create what's known as a straw man. Your idea of what evolution is. And then you attack that. And someone who holds to evolution, they say, well, actually, that's not what I believe, so I'm not going to listen at all. So what is evolution? Well, John Blanchard, the Christian apologist, described it this way. He said, put very simply, macroevolution says that all of the world's life forms are linked seamlessly together in a natural process of evolution. One species arising from another by spontaneous, random, natural means without any external power or direction in an unbroken chain going right back to the single spark of life. So that's the general theory of macroevolution. So sometime in the dim and distant past, something came alive. And evolution doesn't try and explain how it came alive. That's a different subject to science. But something came alive and it was very simple. And over time, it got more complicated. And when the changes allowed it to survive better and have more offspring, it thrived. And it spread, and gradually things split off into different species until we get the great abundance of life that we see around us today. And that's sort of an overview of what macroevolution looks like. I'll explain what the macroevolution is in a moment. And people usually link it back to Charles Darwin. He wasn't the first person to come up with this. If you look into the dim and depths of time, ancient Hinduism, they had some ideas that lean towards evolution. Some of the Greek philosophers did as well. But it was really in the end of the 1700s, the 1800s, that people were really starting to think about this. It was an interesting time in history because German critical scholarship had undermined the belief in the Bible being history. They decided it was a construct of humans, and people were starting to believe that. And the rich folk, you know how there's fads and trends? Well, the fad and trend for rich folk back then was geology. They were all into their fossils and going out and finding fossils. And within the world of geology, they decided that they needed millions and millions of years to explain it. There's an awfully long word, uniformitarianism, which is about how we look at what's happening today, and that's the sort of the uniform processes, and we know how long it takes for things to happen today, so that's how long it's taken in the back. So they look at this data and they say, right, well, it's taken 10 years to do a millimetre. Well, this is kilometres thick. It's taken millions, if not billions of years to arrive. So there was this thing where the people were questioning what the Bible said, and they'd accepted that the world was years old. And then Charles Darwin came along with his book. From the viewpoint of these people who wanted to disprove the Bible, it was the right book at the right time. For those of us wanting to defend the Bible, it was the wrong book at the wrong time. It was. But anyway, in 1859, he published his famous book on the origin of species. And he'd done a lot of work over decades researching this book and putting it together. And he came up with a series of ideas. some of which I've already mentioned. So living creatures, they produce lots of offspring, lots of children, more than can actually survive, and each one is slightly different. Some of those differences will help the creatures survive when they're in competition with their siblings. It may be a little difference that helps them to escape from predators or to find food. When this difference or this trait is inheritable, all of the parents' offspring will start life with this new trait. So it will start to spread. Their children will have it. And slowly, these traits will spread through a population. And he called this process natural selection. And from this process, he believed that all life started out very simply. And through natural selection, we got where we are today. And this diagram here is sort of the classic Darwinian tree of life. This was published shortly after Origin of Species had come out. So you've got the spark of life down here, and you've got the divisions going up. So there'll be fungi, there'll be plants, there'll be animals, and it goes up and it gradually branches until we get all of the different forms of life that we see around us. And this is all done through natural selection. Now, Darwin based his idea of natural selection upon artificial selection, which is what farmers do. If farmers decide that they want some sheep with thicker and woollier fleece, what do? They find the male sheep with the thickest and woolliest fleece, and they cross that with the female sheep with the thickest and woolliest fleece, and then the lambs, they will have thick and woolly fleeces. And if you keep doing that over the generations, you eventually end up with sheep which are really, really woolly. And you can do that with all sorts of animals. You can breed for desired traits. You can pick them out and breed for them. With Darwin, he focused on pigeons. Pigeons are a great way of looking at this because they have a fairly short generation time. So you can breed them quite quickly and quickly select for things. And Darwin thought that the world does this on a grand scale, and it's not directed, it's all random. There's no guidance. That's the big difference between what farmers do and natural selection. Farmers are picking out what they want and selecting for it, while in the world around them, well, in natural selection, it's completely random. There is no guiding principle at all. And it's all about things surviving. Now, the kind of change that produces the sheep with the thicker fleece, that's known as microevolution. That is where within the species there's the genetics are already there, and you're just getting it expressed a bit more. At no point does that sheep turn into a goat. Darwin thought that given enough time, the sheep would turn into a goat. You would get a completely new species arising. And that's macroevolution. Macroevolution is where you get new species coming through these changes. Microevolution is where we see variations within the species. And everyone, even Bible creationists, believe in microevolution. That's something that we can observe. But the macroevolution, we can't see that at all. Well, when Darwin released it, then people quickly accepted it. And I've got here a quote from Steve Jones, another evolutionist, and he writes, "Before Darwin, the great majority of naturalists believed that species were immutable productions. That means they never changed and had been separately created. Today, his theory that they undergo modifications and are descendants of pre-existing forms is accepted by everyone, or by everyone not determined, everyone not determined to believe it." And for a while, it was really popular. But then towards the end of the 1800s and into the 1900s, Darwin's theory was largely, it wasn't forgotten, but it wasn't as popular. It was only in the 1930s that it had a bit of a boost, where scientists came along and they combined it with genetics and ecology and zoology and paleontology to create what we know today as evolution. So Kirsten Burkitt, who was one of my lecturers at Bible College, she wrote about this, and she wrote, "Today what is taught as evolutionary theory is generally referred to as the neo-Darwinian synthesis. And this recognises that modern evolutionary theory is really not Darwin's theory. So get that, things have changed since the origin of species. The Darwinian name provides historical recognition of an important thinker in the field, but the theory has moved on since then. Neo-Darwinism recognises chromosomes as a key ingredient for inheritance, and it was only later, when the structure of DNA was determined by Watson and Crick in 1953, that the role of DNA, genes and mutations was understood. And today, as Stephen Meyer writes, evolution can refer to anything from trivial cyclical changes within the limits of a pre-existing gene pool to the creation of entirely novel genetic information and structure as a result of natural selection acting on random mutations. So we see that things have moved on a long way since Darwin came up with his theory. So it's now got genes and DNA and all sorts of things involved in it as well. So we've got there microevolution and macroevolution. I've already explained that. And when you listen to those TV personalities, when you see them standing at the beginning of Planet Earth 3 talking about evolution, or the one that Chris Packham did, Earth, that was particularly bad, you get the impression that everything in the biological sciences is understood through the lens of evolution. But that's not true at all. I worked 8.5 years as an protein biochemist, and I never made any use of the theory of evolution at all. It was irrelevant to the work we were doing. And that's true of nearly every branch of biological and medical science. So Mark Kirschner, a leading biologist, has said, in fact, over the last 100 years, almost all of biology has proceeded independent of evolution, except evolutionary biology itself. Molecular biology, biochemistry, physiology have not taken evolution into account at all. So evolution is sitting there in the background as an idea, but it's not used in the day-to-day business of most biological sciences. So why is it considered so important by so many people? Because for some scientists, evolution is more than a theory. In fact, it's a philosophy, or even, you could say, that they disagree, a religious belief. So John Lennox, quoting a famous neurobiologist, he wrote this, the quote is a really interesting quote. Listen to this. Evolution began to be invoked in biology apparently as a substitute for God. From standing for a technical hypothesis, the term was rapidly twisted to mean an atheistic, metaphysical principle whose invocation could relieve a man of any theological shivers at the spectacle of the universe, spelt with a capital E, and dishonestly decked in the prestige of the scientific theory of evolution, which in fact gave it no shred of justification. Evolutionism became the name for a whole anti-religious philosophy in which evolution played the role of a more or less personal deity as the real force in the universe. And when you watch these shows, they talk about evolution as being a person who sorts out a problem. You see that a lot. And that's evolutionism. That's not evolution. It's also called scientism. So we need to be aware that when people are talking about evolution, they are often actually talking about an atheistic philosophy. And that's where the conflict is. It's not between science and Christianity. Where there is conflict is between atheism and Christianity, just that the atheists are disguising where they stand and what they mean. So when you're talking to an unbeliever, what do they mean by evolution? Are they talking about a scientific theory that seeks to explain how life arose on Earth, looking at fossils and genetics, the neo-Darwinian synthesis? Or are they listening to evolutionism, which is an atheistic theory, and it is a worldview? And we'll talk a little bit more about that in my second talk. So we need to be aware of how the question can be understood in different ways. Well, what I want to do for my last 15 minutes or so is just talk about some evidence which shows that evolution is not the open and shut case that people think it is. Is it a strong argument or is it a weak argument? And these are areas where you can sort of ask people these questions and get them to start thinking about evolution and helping them to realise that it's not as open and shut as it used to be. So back in 1986, Michael Denton, a molecular biologist and medical doctor, wrote a very interesting book called Evolution, A Theory in Crisis. And if you can get hold of that book, it's well worth reading. It's a really good read, that one is. And he brought up several areas where there's problems. So he talked about the failure of homology, which is where different animals have structures which look the same. So think about the wing of a bird, the wing of a bat, the wing of a flying fish, and how the wings are all the same. That's a homology. Then there's the fossil record, molecular biology, the whole question of how did life begin. And we now know creatures are far too complicated to arise by chance. And that's a big challenge to evolution. And evolution is a paradigm under pressure, which is going to be the focus really of my second talk. Nothing has changed since 1986. In 2013, Stephen Mayer brought out a book, Darwin's Doubt, which covers some of the same areas in more detail. And he writes, as an increasing number of evolutionary biologists have noted, natural selection explains only the survival of the fittest, not the arrival of the fittest. The technical literature in biology is now replete with world-class biologists routinely expressing doubts about various aspects of neo-Darwinian theory, and especially about its central tenet, namely the alleged creative power of natural selection and mutation mechanism. Evolution is far from a watertight argument. It has many problems, holes in the theory, and questions that it cannot answer. And I just want to draw out two problem areas, the fossil record and molecular biology. And these are important ones to talk about because they are picking up on two foundations of evolutionary theory. Universal common ancestry. Do we see it in the fossil record or don't we? And then natural selection, the random production of change. So let's start thinking about fossils for a minute or two. I'm sure some of you can remember your geology and how there's three different sorts of rock. There's igneous rock, which is lava that's turned solid, come out of volcanoes. There's sedimentary rock, which is laid down underneath water. It's sediment that's solidified, or sometimes it forms in deserts. And then there's metamorphic rock, which is rock that's been taken back into the Earth's core crust and reprocessed. You only find fossils in sedimentary rock. And they're typically shells and bones, or sometimes signs like tracks left by animals such as footprints. And this picture here is a representation of the geological column. I don't agree with the dates on this side, going all the way back to 4.6 billion years. But you see the different layers are built up. And the idea is that each layer has got different fossils in. The problem is this complete geological record has never been found complete anywhere on Earth. You tend to get a few maybe from here, and then a few from here, and occasionally there's one on top which is from down there, like it's been turned up. This is a construct which people have thought up. And the idea of it is that down here they're very simple, and up here they're much more complicated. But when we look at the fossil record, is that the truth? Is that what really happens? And even Darwin knew that the fossil record didn't support his theory. That's a real surprise for people. He published his book and he knew that there was a problem there. So we've got here a quote from Darwin. It's very long and we're running out of time, so I'll just read the important bits. So Darwin wrote, but we continually overrate the perfection of the geological record and falsely infer, because certain genera or families have not been found beneath a certain stage, that they did not exist before that stage. And then he goes on to say, we forget how large the world is compared to the area that we've explored, and he thought that given enough time, exploration would find the missing links, the transitional forms, where you can see an animal which has got the trait of the parent, and then the child one. There'd be a little bit of both of them mixed together. He thought that they would turn up. 150 years later, most of the world has now been looked at geologically, and for a while they couldn't find anything on land, so they said it must be under the sea. They must be under the sea. Deep sea oil drilling has recovered large numbers of fossils from under the sea, and they still cannot find the transitional forms that evolution requires. So Paul Garner, who is, he's written this very interesting book, and he's a great guy. I've had lunch with him a few times. He wrote, since every group of organisms is thought to have evolved from an earlier group, transitional forms between groups ought to be common. However, convincing examples of such transitional forms are rare. They are far fewer than evolutionary theory would predict. They just can't find them at all. And even someone like Stephen Gould agrees. Now, Stephen Gould was a great evolutionist. He's what you would call a hostile witness. He would completely disagree with the Bible and creationists. He would think they were completely wrong. But when it comes to the fossil record, Stephen Gould writes, the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. In any local area, species does not arrive just gradually by the gradual transformation of its ancestors. It appears all at once and fully formed. And this principle is really shown in the deeper of the rocks, in what they call the Cambrian explosion. And this diagram, which I've enlarged from earlier, it actually shows it quite nicely. You notice here that there's no fossils in these deep rocks, and there's just a little tiny fossil there. And then suddenly, bang, you've got loads of fossils. And they're not simple animals, they're complicated animals. And they suddenly appear, as if from nowhere. And the sort of counter-argument is, well, before that point, it must have been soft-bodied animals that don't fossilise. Well, in-depth studies of those earlier rocks have even found fossils like sponges, which are really soft, and they've got traces of them in the earlier rock. And then suddenly, bang, they're there. All sorts of different animals. You go from nothing to having mollusks, so squids and clams. You've got echinoderms, which are your sea urchins and starfish. Your arthropods, which are your trilobites, lots of trilobites, and insects. And even chordates, which are vertebrates. Vertebrates are part of the chordate group. They suddenly appear. From very little evidence of any form of life, suddenly everything is there. And then these species, they remain the same for millions of years, and then they just seem to die out. And it's impossible for evolution to explain this. Stephen Mayer, he's got a great quote here. Producing sponges, worms and mollusks from single-celled organisms is a little like transforming a spinning top into a bicycle. The bicycle isn't remotely as complex as the automobile sitting beside it, but it represents an enormous leap in technological sophistication over the spinning top. In the Cambrian, you've got these sudden jumps, and going from that, a bit of wood, to a bicycle, to a car, enormous leaps, and nothing in between. So the fossil record just does not provide the sort of evidence that people think it does. This is taken from a creationist book, So up here we've got the evolutionary standard tree, and you've got here what you actually see in the fossil record, where species appear like an orchard instead of a single tree. And then there is some diversification as things go on, and there is an explanation for that as well. And the creationists, they believe that creatures were created by God as kinds. So you have a kind of creature, and then within that kind, there's all the genetic material already in it to allow it to adapt to different environments. So if you take a cat, you've got the different breeds of house cat, haven't you? And then you've got tigers and lions. You know, lions and tigers can, they can crossbreed and produce viable offspring. So they are clearly the same kind. And that sort of microevolution is recognised by Bible-believing Christians as the things that have happened, particularly since Noah's flood. So when we look at the fossil record, we see that there's huge problems. Now, I just want to very quickly show you a video, hopefully it'll work, which goes into the world of molecular biology. Darwin thought that a cell, a single cell, of which we have all got trillions, was a simple thing. It's like a little bit of Lego, a building block with nothing inside it. Molecular biology has now shown us that this isn't the case. And I just want you to look at the complexity of this. We haven't got time to go into detail, we're nearly out of time. But just pick up on the complexity here. And there's a whole nother talk on this. So hopefully it'll work. It's hard to imagine, but right now you've got billions of those little things walking around inside you. It's incredible, really. And the cell is so unbelievably complex. And they're now starting to understand that all of the information to make the cell doesn't come just from the DNA, but there's levels of organisation above that which they don't understand at the moment. It's a field of science called epigenetics, above genetics, which is truly fascinating. And it's really undermining the neo-Darwinian synthesis. So the evidence that is being drawn now from biology really does say that it is a theory which is in crisis. I'll just conclude with this slide. Can a random, unguided process which has no goal or purpose really be responsible for the incredible complexity that we see within the world of molecular biology? It takes a lot more faith than I have to believe that it all came together through natural processes. Right, I'm just about on time, so I'm just going to recommend a couple of books quickly. Two of these we've got on the book table. So we've got the book there by Paul Gardner. If you want to find out what creation scientists are teaching nowadays, this is, in my opinion, the best book that is available on it. It's a few years old now, but it's still current, and it'll be quite different to what you think. And maybe quite different to what you've heard if you've been to an Answers in Genesis or a Creation Ministries International talk. This one, The God of Creation, I'll put it up there because if you want to understand about those opening chapters of Genesis and the theology of them, Richard Phillips has written a very helpful book there. It doesn't deal with the creation-evolution debate at all. It is just theology, and it helps us understand how to interpret those opening chapters of Genesis. And then Darwin's Doubt, the Stephen Mayer book, is quite expensive, that one, so I felt it wasn't right to put it on the book table. And that's from the Intelligent Design group of people. So they don't argue from the Bible, they just look at the science. And if you want a book which is filled with things which undermine evolution, then go for Darwin's Doubt. Right, well, thank you everyone for your attention. I've overrun by just 5 minutes. Sorry about that.